Picture a train platform on a cold night in March of 1924. It is nearly empty. A handful of officials stand in the shadows, checking their watches, glancing nervously toward the street as if they are afraid a crowd might gather. And waiting on that platform, clutching a single suitcase, is a woman who has never in her life carried her own luggage. She has never cooked a meal. She has never counted out coins to pay for anything. For as long as she can remember, there were servants for that. Dozens of them, sometimes hundreds, moving through marble corridors and palaces that looked out over the Bosphorus. She was born inside one of the oldest and most powerful dynasties on earth. And now, in the space of about 72 hours, she has been told that she is no longer a citizen of the country her family ruled for more than 600 years. She has a piece of paper that says she must leave. She has 1 year to sell everything she owns. And she is never, under any circumstances, allowed to come back. She believes, standing on that platform, that this is temporary, that in a few months, the anger will cool and someone will call her home. She is wrong. Many of the people waiting with her that night will die in foreign cities in rented rooms without ever seeing Istanbul again. This is the story of what happened to the Ottoman royal family after their empire disappeared. Not the polished version, the real one, the villas that turned into boarding houses, the princes who ended up driving taxis, the Sultan's relatives who went hungry, and the astonishing, almost unbelievable second act that came generations later. So stay with me, because by the end of this, you will understand something that most people who love history have never actually been told. Part 1. The world they were about to lose. To feel how far this family fell, you have to understand how high they had been. The House of Osman began in the year 1299 when a minor warlord in northwestern Anatolia named Osman started carving out a little principality on the edge of a collapsing Byzantine world. Nobody at the time would have bet on him. And yet within a couple of centuries, his descendants had taken Constantinople, the great prize that had resisted invaders for 1,000 years, renamed it, and turned it into the capital of an empire that stretched across 3 continents. At its height, the Ottoman Empire ran from the walls of Vienna in the north to the deserts of the Arabian Peninsula, from the mountains of the Caucasus to the shores of North Africa. 36 sultans in an unbroken male line sat on that throne. They ruled tens of millions of people, Turks and Arabs, Greeks and Armenians, Slavs and Kurds, Jews and Christians and Muslims, all under a single crown. And the Sultan wasn't only a king, he also carried the title of caliph, which in theory made him the spiritual leader of Sunni Muslims across the entire world. Think about what that means. This was not just political power, it was sacred authority stretching back 13 centuries all the way to the death of the Prophet Muhammad. The Ottoman Sultan claimed to be the guardian of the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. Kings and emperors in Europe negotiated with him, feared him, sent gifts to him. For most of that time, the family looked untouchable. The palaces along the water shimmered with gold. The court had its own elaborate rituals, its own hierarchy, its own hidden world of the imperial household where the Sultan's mother could be one of the most powerful people in the empire. And that is exactly why the collapse, when it finally came, was so shocking. Empires this old are supposed to be permanent. People inside them cannot imagine any other reality. But nothing lasts forever. And the truth is, by the time our story really begins, the ground had been crumbling for a very long time. Part 2. The long, slow dying. Here is something people misunderstand. The Ottoman Empire did not fall in one dramatic moment. It died the way a great tree dies, slowly from the inside, over the better part of 100 years, until one strong wind finally brought it down. By the middle of the 1800s, European diplomats had already given the empire a cruel nickname. They called it the sick man of Europe, and the sickness was real. Piece by piece, the empire was losing its limbs. Greece broke away, Serbia, Romania, Bulgaria followed. Russia pressed in from the north. France took Algeria. Britain quietly took control of Egypt. The military that had once terrified the whole of Europe was falling behind the new industrial armies of the West. The sultans understood the danger. They genuinely tried to fix it. There were waves of reform aimed at modernizing the law, the schools, the army. One sultan, Abdulhamid II, tried to hold everything together through a mix of iron control and clever diplomacy, playing the great powers against one another, building railways, and leaning hard on his role as caliph to rally Muslim loyalty. For a while, it slowed the bleeding, but it wasn't enough. The empire was drowning in debt to European banks. Its many peoples were catching the fever of nationalism, each dreaming of their own state instead of a shared empire. Then, in 1908, came a group of young military officers and reformers who believed they could save the empire by force of will. They pushed the old sultan aside and put his brother on the throne as little more than a figurehead. They wanted modernization. They wanted Turkish national pride. And in 1914, they made the single most catastrophic decision in the entire history of the dynasty. They took the empire into the First World War on the losing side. That was the wind that brought the tree down. 4 years of war bled the empire white. There were a few bright spots. The defense at Gallipoli, where a young commander named Mustafa Kemal made his name. But everywhere else, the map kept shrinking. British armies swept through the Arab lands. When it was over, in the autumn of 1918, the Ottomans signed an armistice and simply surrendered. Foreign soldiers, British, French, Italian, marched into Istanbul and occupied the ancient capital itself. The empire still technically existed. There was still a sultan in his palace, but everyone could feel it. The end was coming. Part 3. The man who rose from Thessaloniki, and into that vacuum stepped the man who would finish the dynasty off, Mustafa Kemal. The same officer who had become a hero at Gallipoli refused to accept the humiliating peace the Allies wanted to impose, a treaty that would have carved Turkey into pieces and handed the fragments to foreign powers. Instead, he went into the heart of Anatolia and built a nationalist movement from the ground up. He gathered soldiers, he rallied a broken and exhausted population, and he launched what became the Turkish War of Independence. It worked. Against enormous odds, his forces drove out the invading armies and secured the borders of what would become modern Turkey. But Kemal did not want to simply save the old order. He wanted to burn it down and build something entirely new. A secular republic, a modern nation-state, with no room in it for sultans or caliphs. And so, on the 1st of November 1922, the new assembly in Ankara voted to abolish the Sultanate outright. 623 years of monarchy ended by a show of hands. The last sultan, Mehmed VI, a tired, elderly man who had inherited nothing but wreckage, suddenly found himself in real danger. The new government considered him a traitor who had collaborated with the foreign occupiers. There was talk of putting him on trial. And in that era, everyone remembered what had happened in Russia only a few years earlier, when the Tsar and his entire family were shot in a cellar. So the last sultan chose to run. In the pre-dawn hours of the 17th of November, 1922, he slipped out of his palace in secret. British soldiers spirited him and his young son through the quiet streets in an ambulance and down to the water, where a British battleship was waiting. As the ship pulled away from the only home he had ever known, the last Ottoman sultan looked back at the city his family had ruled for nearly 5 centuries. He knew he would never return. He was right. He would spend his final years in exile on the Italian Riviera, sliding into debt, and when he died a few years later, shopkeepers reportedly came to seize his belongings over unpaid bills before his body was even properly laid to rest. That is how the reign of the sultans ended. But the family's ordeal was only beginning. Part 4. Law number 431. For a little while after the sultan fled, the dynasty was allowed to keep one last shred of dignity. The assembly separated the two roles the sultan used to hold. The political job, the sultanate, was gone, but the spiritual title, the caliphate, was handed to a cousin, Abdulmajid II, on the condition that he stay completely out of politics and simply be a religious figurehead. It didn't last. Abdulmajid took the ceremonial role seriously, perhaps too seriously for a government that wanted the old world erased. Crowds still gathered when he appeared in public, and to the new republic, that lingering reverence was a threat. So they finished the job. On the 3rd of March, 1924, the assembly passed a law abolishing the caliphate entirely. ending an institution that had existed in one form or another for 13 centuries. And on the very same day, they passed something even more personal. Law number 431, the Law of Exile. This law did something almost without parallel in modern history. It declared that every member of the Ottoman dynasty was stripped of Turkish citizenship. Not exiled temporarily, expelled permanently. 156 people were named directly, and when you add the children, spouses, and loyal servants who refused to abandon them, the number leaving swelled into the hundreds. They were given a matter of days to get out. They were told to liquidate everything they owned within a year, or the state would simply seize it, and the law forbade them from ever setting foot on Turkish soil again. They weren't even allowed to change trains inside the country while passing through. The last caliph didn't even get the few days most others were given. He was hustled onto a train in the middle of the night, sent out through a smaller station rather than the main one because officials feared crowds might turn out to see him off, and put on the Orient Express toward Europe with almost nothing. Sit with that image for a moment. One night you are the spiritual heir to an empire that lasted 6 centuries. The next, you are on a train in the dark with a suitcase, watching your homeland disappear behind you, holding a document that says you can never come back. The women left from the main station in Istanbul, waiting on those platforms in the cold, still half believing it was temporary. It was not. Part 5. The fall to earth. Now comes the part of the story that is almost hard to believe, because the fall did not stop when they crossed the border. It kept going straight down. Understand who these people were. They had grown up inside a bubble of absolute luxury. Princes had been raised for command and ceremony, not for jobs. Princesses had been raised to run great households, but many had literally never handled money in their lives, never boiled water, never negotiated a price. The empire had provided everything, and now the empire was gone and the money was gone with it. The last Sultan had settled in San Remo, on the Italian coast, so many of the family drifted toward the south of France to be near one another. And there, in exile, the reality set in fast. Their travel papers were only valid for a single year. Once they expired, some of these former royals were effectively stateless, people without a country, unable to travel legally at all. France eventually offered them a compromise, not citizenship, but courtesy passports that at least let them move around. It was a strange twist of history. Descendants of the very Sultan who had once sheltered a French king, now reduced to begging a French government for the right to exist. And the poverty was crushing. Villas gave way to cramped apartments. Family heirlooms and jewelry were sold off, piece by piece, just to buy time. Princesses who had been waited on their whole lives took work in hotel kitchens and as seamstresses. Princes drove cars for hire. Some family members, scattered and cut off from any support, are recorded as having gone genuinely hungry. A few even reduced to searching for scraps. There were sultans and heirs to the throne who died in borrowed rooms, penniless and half forgotten, in cities where nobody knew who they had once been. A few wealthy Muslim rulers elsewhere in the world, princes in India, in Egypt, in Arabia, tried to send money to help the fallen dynasty. But the family was so scattered across so many countries that much of the aid never reached the people who needed it most. And Ankara watched them constantly, suspicious of every marriage and every move, terrified that some plot to restore the monarchy might be brewing. There was no plot. There was only survival. Part 6. Scattered to the ends of the high earth. What makes this exile so unusual is how completely the family was flung apart. The Romanovs of Russia were murdered. A horror, but a single contained catastrophe. The Habsburgs of Austria lost their empire, but managed to hold on to some private wealth and status. The Ottomans experienced something different. They were not killed. They were dispersed. Deliberately, permanently, across an entire hemisphere and told to disappear into ordinary life. So they did. Branches of the family put down roots wherever they could find safety and work. Some stayed in France. Some went to Egypt, where an Ottoman connection still carried a little prestige. Others settled in Lebanon, in Syria, in Italy, and eventually across the Atlantic in the United States. Over the decades that followed, they became businessmen and teachers, writers and clerks, ordinary people with an extraordinary surname. One heir, who would eventually become head of the family, spent much of his life in New York City, working quietly as a librarian until his retirement. A man who, in another timeline, might have been addressed as a sultan, cataloging books in Manhattan. Another branch settled in Damascus and never really left. That detail will matter later, in a way that is genuinely heartbreaking. The children born in exile grew up hearing stories about a homeland they had never seen. Descriptions of the Bosphorus, of the palaces, of marble halls and crystal chandeliers, the way you might hear a fairy tale. To them, Istanbul wasn't a memory, it was a legend told by grieving parents, a place that belonged to the family in every way except the one that counted. They could not go there. And back in Turkey, the erasure was thorough. The new republic spent decades defining itself as the opposite of everything the Ottomans had been. Ottoman history was taught in schools as a story of decay and failure. The palaces became museums and government offices. The very name of the dynasty became something like an embarrassment. It was as if a whole nation had agreed to pretend that its own past, 600 years, had been a mistake. Part 7. The Long Road Home. And yet, slowly, quietly, the door began to open again. Time does what politics cannot. As the years passed and the republic grew more secure, the fear of the old dynasty faded. There was no army waiting to restore the throne. There was just a scattered family growing old in foreign cities, dreaming of home. The first crack came in 1951, when the government finally allowed the female members of the dynasty to return to Turkey. Imagine what that must have been like. Elderly women who had left as young princesses, stepping off a train into a country that had been reinvented while they were gone, walking streets they half remembered, looking for palaces that were now ticket-selling museums. The men had to wait far longer. It was not until 1974, a full half-century after the exile began, that the male members of the family were finally permitted to come home. By then, most of the original exiles were already dead. The men who returned were largely sons and grandsons, people born abroad who had built entire lives elsewhere. Some came back, many did not. After 50 years, what was there to return to? The wealth was gone. The status was gone. Coming home meant being an ordinary citizen in a country that had spent 5 decades trying to forget you existed. When the family had gone into exile, they had needed a surname, because the modern republic required one, and sultans had never used family names the way commoners did. So they chose Osmanolu. It means, simply, son of Osman. A quiet nod to the warlord who had started it all 7 centuries earlier. It was a way of saying, whatever they take from us, they cannot take who we are. Part 8. The family today. So where are they now? The Osmanolu family still exists. Several dozen living descendants scattered across Turkey, Europe, the Middle East, and the United States. They are business people, academics, writers, professionals, ordinary lives, extraordinary bloodline. One descendant, born in Britain, has spent years writing books to preserve the family's history so that it isn't lost as the last living memory of the empire fades away. The headship of the house still passes by the old rule, to the eldest living male of the line. And here is where the story lands one final painful blow. For years, the head of the family was an elderly prince who had been born in exile and lived his entire life in Damascus, Syria. He wanted more than anything to end his days back in Istanbul, but the Syrian civil war and the collapse of relations between the two countries made it impossible. He died in Damascus in January of 2021 at the age of 90. A man who led the House of Osman and yet never once managed to set foot in the homeland of his ancestors. The title then passed to his brother, Harun Osman Osmanolu, born in 1932, who had made it back to Istanbul decades earlier and lives there still, the current head of a dynasty that no longer rules anything at all. And that is the strange place the family occupies today. because in the last couple of decades, Turkey's relationship with its Ottoman past has completely reversed. Where the empire was once a source of shame, it is now a source of pride. Wildly popular television dramas about the sultans have become global hits, watched from the Middle East to Latin America. Politicians speak warmly of Ottoman greatness. Tourists flood the old palaces. For the Osmanoglu family, this has produced a bewildering new reality. After decades of being unwanted in their own country, they are now treated as living curiosities, invited to cultural events, interviewed on television, met with a kind of cautious respect. Some of them have walked back through the very palace rooms their grandparents were expelled from, seeing with their own eyes the chandeliers and the water views they had only ever heard described. But make no mistake, they have no power, no throne, no claim. They are private citizens with a famous name. The empire is history. The exile is fading into memory as the last people who lived through it pass away. Part 9. Why it still matters. Step back from the family for a moment, because the fall of the Ottomans wasn't only a private tragedy, it reshaped the world we still live in. When the empire collapsed, its vast Arab territories were carved up by Britain and France, who drew borders across the Middle East with rulers and pencils, often ignoring the tribes, faiths, and peoples on the ground. Many of the region's modern conflicts trace back in part to those lines drawn a century ago, and the abolition of the caliphate left a hole in the Muslim world that has never quite been filled. For 13 centuries, there had been some figure claiming that mantle of spiritual leadership. When it vanished overnight, it left a vacuum, one that has been argued over, mourned, and in some cases, violently exploited ever since. The ghost of the institution that was abolished in 1924 still moves through global politics today. That is the scale of what fell when this one family fell. So what do we take from all of this? Here is what stays with me. This is a story about what happens when power is not just lost, but deliberately stripped away, down to the bone. The Ottomans didn't only lose an empire, they lost their citizenship, they lost their homes, they lost their wealth, their titles, and for half a century, even the right to stand on their own native soil. People who had commanded millions ended up washing dishes and going hungry in foreign cities. And yet, the most remarkable thing about this family is not how far they fell. It's that they survived it all. The House of Osman, founded by an obscure warlord in 1299, still exists. Its members still walk the earth, living quiet, ordinary lives, carrying a name that connects them to one of the greatest empires the world has ever seen, which raises a question that reaches far beyond the Ottomans. When everything you have built comes crashing down, the wealth, the walls, the crown, what is actually left? Is it the gold and the property and the titles? Or is it something you can't confiscate? A name, a memory, a sense of who you are? The Ottoman family would tell you it's the second thing. Everything else was taken from them, and they are still here. If this story moved you the way it moved me, do me a favor, drop a comment and tell me, do you think the dynasty was treated fairly, or was the exile a cruelty history should remember? Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next deep dive. Give this video a like if you learned something, and I'll see you in the next one.